My wife handed me divorce papers at work, while my boss stood behind her smiling. I signed without reading the final page, because neither of them knew I had inherited $510 million and 60% of the company he ran. Before I reached the elevator, a bank compliance officer called about a $1 million mortgage opened in my name. I asked one question: whose computer authorized it? Then the line went silent. I appreciate you choosing to spend this time with me. One small thing before we start. Leave a comment and let me know. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they were working against you? A simple yes or no is enough. I read every one. A quick note: some details in this story are adapted for narrative depth. The lesson behind it is what truly matters. I am 70 years old, and I am still trying to process the fact that my own family tried to bury me alive on a Tuesday morning. The fluorescent lights above my drafting table buzzed the way they always did. That low electrical hum I had listened to for 38 years at Ashcombe Manufacturing. I was hunched over structural load calculations for the Westerville Bridge retrofit. Reading glasses perched on my nose. A half-finished cup of coffee growing cold beside my elbow. It was an ordinary morning. It was the last ordinary morning I would ever have. The door to my office slammed open, and a manila envelope hit my blueprints like a slap. Coffee spilled across hours of meticulous pencil work, spreading in a dark stain over calculations I had checked 3 times. Lorraine stood in the doorway. My wife of 44 years, 66 years old, wearing the tailored designer coat I had bought her last month. Her face was arranged into something cold and rehearsed. A mask she had clearly practiced in a mirror before driving here. I want a divorce. Eugene, I refuse to spend another day in a stagnant marriage with a man who has zero ambition and no future. Her perfume cut through the stale office air, sharp and expensive. And behind her, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, stood Wade Kingsley, 48 years old, the newly installed executive director of Ashcombe Manufacturing. He wore his Italian suit like armor and wielded budget cuts like a blade. And right now he was grinning at me, the way a man grins when he believes the fight is already over. Come on, Eugene, Wade said. You are an old relic in a young man's game. Just sign the papers and disappear quietly. Pity only goes so far. I looked at the divorce papers soaking up my spilled coffee. I looked at my wife's rehearsed contempt. I looked at my boss, grinning in my doorway like he owned the air I breathed. And I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a gold fountain pen that had belonged to my brother Howard. Let me be clear about something. I did not tremble. I did not beg. I did not read a single clause. I uncapped that pen and signed my name on every page Lorraine had flagged with those little adhesive arrows. And I did it with the steady hand of a man writing a receipt for a war he had already won. Because neither of them knew what had happened 48 hours earlier. Neither of them knew that on Sunday morning. I had received a phone call informing me that my brother Howard had died of a heart attack in his sleep. His estate $510 million, including a 60% controlling stake in Ashcombe Holdings, had been left entirely to me. The man they were ambushing owned every wall, every floor, and every contract in the building where they stood. I handed the signed envelope back to Lorraine. She snatched it without a word, pivoted on her heel, and walked out. Wade lingered for a moment, studying me with that smug, patronizing expression, then followed her toward the elevator. I listened to his Italian leather shoes clicking down the linoleum hallway, each step carrying him further from the man he thought I was and closer to the man I was about to become. Have you ever walked out of a room knowing that the people celebrating behind you just handed you the exact ammunition you needed to destroy them? I stood in the empty hallway outside my office, watching the elevator doors close on my wife and the man who had spent 8 months systematically dismantling my career, and my phone vibrated against my calloused palm. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. I answered. Mr. Ashford, my name is Nora Ballard. The voice was careful, precise, and carried the tone of someone who had found something deeply wrong. She was a fraud compliance analyst at Midwest Federal Savings, 57 years old. And she was calling because a secondary mortgage of $2.2 million had been submitted against my residential property less than 48 hours ago. The digital authorization flags were inconsistent with my historical profile. Someone had used my identity to open a mortgage I had never requested, never signed, and never authorized. My coffee-stained blueprints were still drying on my desk. My signed divorce papers were riding an elevator to the parking garage. And now a stranger was telling me that someone had forged my name on a $2.2 million mortgage. I asked one question: whose computer authorized it? The line went dead. Not a dropped signal, not static. The sharp, deliberate silence of someone severing the connection. Nora Ballard had found something she was not supposed to find, and someone had stopped her before she could tell me who was behind it. But to understand why I did not panic, you need to know what happened 48 hours before that Tuesday morning. To understand why I smiled while signing away my entire life, you need to know what happened 48 hours before that Tuesday morning on a quiet Sunday, when a dead man changed everything. I was sitting on the back porch of my Upper Arlington home with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The neighborhood was still. Birds scratched at the feeder my wife had stopped refilling months before. Morning light came through the porch rail in thin yellow bars. And I was thinking about nothing more important than whether to mow the lawn, when my phone rang from a restricted number. The voice on the other end was measured and precise, trained to deliver catastrophic news without inflection. He introduced himself as Sterling Prescott, Senior Fiduciary Counsel to the Cornerstone Legacy Trust. And he was calling to inform me that my older brother, Howard Ashford, had died of sudden heart failure the previous week. I had not spoken to Howard in 30 years. We had parted over something so old and so stubborn that neither of us could remember who swung first. Only that neither had been willing to swing last. Now he was dead, and the silence between us had become permanent. Mr. Ashford, your brother named you as the sole heir to his entire estate, Sterling said. The total verified value is approximately $510 million in liquid assets, real estate, and investment instruments. But there is something else. Among the holdings is a 60% controlling stake in the parent conglomerate of Ashcombe Manufacturing, acquired through a private vehicle called Sovereign Peak Capital. I set the cold coffee on the porch rail and stared at the bird feeder. $510 million, and it could not buy back a single one of the 30 years my brother and I had wasted in silence. Howard had spent his final months tracking me down, rewriting his estate documents, building a trust structure that would transfer everything to the brother he had not spoken to since we were both young enough to believe that pride was the same thing as strength. His last act was an apology he never got to speak aloud. I gripped the cold ceramic mug and tried to understand what it meant that the company where I had worked for 38 years as a mid-level engineer was now, in every legal sense, mine. That was Sunday. On Tuesday, Lorraine slammed divorce papers onto my blueprints and Wade told me to disappear quietly. I signed everything, because I already knew something they would not discover for 90 days. Now I need to take you forward again, past the severed phone call, past the elevator doors closing on my wife's rehearsed contempt, to Tuesday afternoon, when I walked into the Huntington Center in downtown Columbus and rode a retinal scan elevator to the 40th floor. Sterling Prescott met me at the end of a corridor that smelled of polished concrete and sealed air. He was 58, sharp-jawed and meticulously groomed. The kind of man whose calm voice could dismantle empires or build them, depending on which side of the table you occupied. His handshake was firm. His conference room was soundproofed. Encrypted asset maps glowed on the wall monitors. Money at this scale is not comfort. It is a weapon. And I had just been handed a loaded cannon while my enemies were still toasting their victory. The The current executive board believes their majority shareholder is a foreign investment consortium, Sterling explained. They have no idea that Sovereign Peak Capital is one individual. They certainly do not know that individual is you. I sat with that for a moment. Wade Kingsley had spent 8 months gutting my department, slashing budgets, transferring my projects, relocating me to a windowless office. He had done all of it believing he answered to a faceless overseas fund. He answered to me. I want a forensic accounting team deployed by end of day, I said. Every ledger, every vendor contract, every expense report Wade Kingsley has touched since his appointment, and preserve every byte of data connected to that mortgage before anyone can alter it. Sterling nodded. He had been waiting for this. We have exactly 90 days before the quarterly board meeting. I continued. Let him climb. Let him promote himself. Let my wife celebrate and Wade build his empire. Arrogance breeds carelessness. And I want them so confident they stop looking over their shoulders entirely. I walked out of that 40th floor office knowing I owned every wall Wade leaned against, every chair Lorraine sat in to plan my ruin, and every contract that employed the son who had not yet shown me the full depth of his betrayal. The war had begun, and they would not hear a single shot until it was far too late. The forensic team worked fast. 2 days after I declared war from the 40th floor, Sterling Prescott had already drawn first blood, and the wound it opened was one I never expected. He did not waste time on pleasantries when I arrived Thursday morning. He simply turned his laptop toward me and said, "We found the device." The encrypted monitors on the conference room wall displayed a chain of authentication logs pulled directly from the bank's internal systems. Sterling walked me through each layer with the patience of a man who understood that the information he was about to deliver would land like a surgical strike. The mortgage application was submitted at 2:47 a.m. on a Saturday, he began, scrolling through highlighted timestamps. The IP address traces to a private executive terminal. The device fingerprint matches a single registered workstation. The two-factor authentication token belongs to a personal security key issued to one individual. He paused. The blue glow of the monitors reflected off the polished concrete walls. And in that silence, I could hear the ventilation system humming behind the sealed panels. The terminal is registered to your son, Garrett Ashford. I pressed my fingers flat against the cool mahogany of the conference table and said nothing. The metallic taste of suppressed rage filled my mouth like a coin pressed against my tongue. My son. The boy whose private school tuition I had paid in full. The young man whose university education I had funded without asking for a cent in return. The adult whose first home I had helped secure with a down payment drawn from my retirement savings. I had built a ladder for him, rung by rung, and he had used the height I gave him to forge my name on a document designed to destroy me. I want you to imagine something. You pay every cent of your child's education, so he graduates debt-free. And then he uses the skills you financed to forge your signature on a theft worth more than you will earn in the rest of your life. That is not betrayal. That is a custom-built weapon, assembled from parts you provided yourself. Sterling continued. The beneficiary mailing address on the loan documents is your former marital residence in Upper Arlington, the property your wife claims sole ownership of during the temporary hearing. The mortgage is structured so that the liability falls entirely on you, while the collateral benefit attaches to the property holder. Lorraine, I said. Lorraine, Sterling confirmed. But the money itself, that was what kept my hands pressed against the table instead of curled into fists. Sterling pulled up a second screen showing the disbursement trail. The extracted funds had not stayed in any account bearing an Ashford name. They had moved through Garrett's terminal like water through a pipe, landing in an intermediary holding account registered in Delaware. That entity does not appear in your son's known financial portfolio, Sterling said. It is not connected to his advisory practice, his personal investments, or any family trust I can identify. Someone else is on the receiving end of this transaction. What kind of man submits a forged mortgage application at 2:47 in the morning? Not a man acting on impulse. Not a man driven by sudden desperation. A man working at that hour is following instructions operating on a timeline set by someone else, using a blueprint drawn by someone with a deeper understanding of banking infrastructure than a 42-year-old financial advisor would possess on his own. Follow the money past the extraction point, I said. Every account it touched, every intermediary, every destination, and find out whether my son has any financial relationship with Wade Kingsley. Formal, informal, or hidden. Sterling made a note in his leather portfolio. The pen scratched against the page in the soundproofed silence. There is one more detail, he said. The Delaware intermediary received a second deposit 11 days before the mortgage was filed. Smaller, approximately $85,000. The source account on that transaction is still encrypted, but the routing pattern is consistent with commercial vendor payments. The kind a corporation makes, not an individual. A corporate payment flowing into the same intermediary that received my stolen mortgage funds. Wade Kingsley ran a corporation. Wade Kingsley had spent 8 months dismantling my department. Wade Kingsley had stood in my doorway 2 days ago, grinning, telling me to disappear. The money trail did not end with my son. It passed through his hands like water through a pipe, flowing somewhere else entirely into accounts that bore no Ashford name. Garrett was not the architect of this theft. He was the instrument, and the hand that wielded him was still hidden in the dark. The next morning, I would check into a motel that charged $40 a night because a broken man needs to look the part. The handler behind my son's forgery was still hidden, but I could not chase shadows from a corner office. A hunted man needs to look hunted. So on day 3, I drove past 3 perfectly decent hotels and pulled into the worst motel I could find. The neon sign outside the railside motor lodge buzzed with a harsh red flicker. Half the letters burned out. The lobby smelled like industrial cleaner poured over something no one wanted to identify. A clerk with a cigarette behind his ear slid a metal room key across the counter without looking up, and I paid $40 cash for room 12. The room was exactly what I needed it to be. A sagging mattress with springs that groaned when I sat on the edge, a faucet that dripped in a rhythm no wrench could fix. Stale cigarette smoke buried so deep in the carpet that a decade of cleaning had only spread it into the walls. Through the thin curtains, red neon bled across the ceiling in a pulse that matched the freight trains rumbling past on the tracks behind the building. I set my battered suitcase on the rickety chair and sat in the dark. Lorraine would picture me here. She would imagine this exact scene, her 70-year-old husband sitting alone in a motel room near a freight yard, staring at water stains on the ceiling, wondering where his life went wrong. She would feel a brief, satisfied flutter and pour herself another glass of wine in the house I'd paid off 20 years ago. Wade would laugh about it over dinner. I smiled. The first genuine smile in days, because for the first time since the ambush, every piece of misery surrounding me was working in my favor. A man who checks into a $40 motel near a freight yard does not look like a man holding a fortune. He looks like a man who is already lost. There is a particular kind of freedom in choosing your own cage. When the walls are part of your strategy, the lock on the door is not a prison, it is a prop. I lay back on the sagging mattress and stared at the pulsing red ceiling, and my mind drifted backward not to the ambush, not to Sterling's 40th floor revelations, but to the 8 months that preceded all of it. The months when Wade Kingsley had taken me apart piece by piece, and I had been too trusting to see the pattern. It started last August. Wade called me into his office with that practiced tone of corporate regret and told me the board was demanding immediate budget cuts across senior staff. Older employees need to make sacrifices so the younger generation can keep their positions, he said. I need you to be a team player, Eugene. My salary was cut by 40%. I absorbed it without complaint, because I believed him. 2 months later, he stripped my authority. 3 major projects I had shepherded for over a decade were reassigned to junior engineers with, as Wade phrased it, more current methodologies. I watched 20 years of institutional knowledge handed to people who had never stress-tested a load-bearing wall in their lives, and I said nothing, because I believed the company needed to evolve. 40%. He did not just cut my income. He cut the legs out from under any legal fight I could mount in a divorce proceeding. And he did it 8 months before Lorraine ever mentioned the word. By January, he had relocated me from my corner office to a windowless room near the supply closet. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead. The ventilation rattled. My drafting table barely fit between the filing cabinets someone had shoved against the far wall. Wade stopped by once, leaned against the door frame the same way he would lean against it 3 months later when Lorraine delivered the papers, and said, "We are consolidating floor space. Nothing personal. Nothing personal." Every move he made was surgically personal. Each cut was designed to look like standard corporate surgery restructuring. Optimization, modernization. But the patient was always the same. Me. He drained my salary so I could not afford a good attorney. He stripped my authority so I had no professional leverage. He isolated me physically so that when the final blow came, no colleague would be close enough to notice or care. Wade had not stumbled into an affair with my wife and then decided to push me aside at work. He had engineered my financial collapse first, methodically, over 8 months, so that when Lorraine finally dropped those papers on my desk, I would have nothing left to fight with. This was never a lapse in judgment. This was a coordinated execution. And the timeline proved that Wade Kingsley was the architect from the very beginning. 2 days later, I stood in a courtroom and let them believe the execution had succeeded. Knowing Wade was the architect changed nothing about the timeline. The courtroom was his next stage, and I intended to give the performance of my life, not as the man who owned the building, but as the man who had lost everything inside it. I arrived at the Franklin County Courthouse 15 minutes early, wearing the same faded suit I had worn the day Lorraine delivered the papers. I made sure my hands trembled when I pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The old varnish on the courtroom benches smelled like decades of broken families, and I shuffled to my seat beside the low-cost attorney I had hired specifically because he knew nothing about trusts or the fortune I was hiding in plain sight. Lorraine sat across the aisle in a conservative gray dress, dabbing at dry eyes with a white tissue. Minimal makeup, modest jewelry. She had rehearsed victimhood in front of her bathroom mirror, and I recognized the performance because I was giving one of my own. Her attorney rose first, a sharp-jawed man in a suit that cost more than my motel room would charge for a month. He addressed the bench with the practiced aggression of someone billing $400 an hour. "Your Honor, my client has endured decades of emotional neglect from a man who refused to advance his career or provide the lifestyle commensurate with his years of employment. She requires immediate protection of the marital assets, full temporary custody of the residence, freezing of joint accounts, and surrender of all vehicles registered in both names." Have you ever stood in a courtroom and deliberately lost not because you were weak, but because winning at that moment would have ruined everything you had spent the last 5 days building? I sat with my hands folded on the table and let every word land without objection. Every demand her lawyer made was another brick in the wall I was building around them. They wanted the house. They could have it and the massive debt buried beneath its foundation. They wanted the accounts. They could have those too. Accounts that would be frozen by federal order before Lorraine ever got to spend what was in them. Judge Hargrove peered down from the bench. A stern-faced woman with silver hair and reading glasses perched low on her nose. She carried the expression of genuine institutional concern, the kind earned from years of watching families dismantle themselves in her courtroom. "Does the respondent intend to contest any of these terms?" she asked, looking past me to my attorney. My lawyer stood with the uncertain posture of a man who had tried to advise his client and been politely ignored. "Your Honor, my client is overwhelmed by the pace of these proceedings. He wishes to accept all terms as presented." The judge removed her glasses and looked directly at me. "Mr. Ashford, I want to be certain you understand the implications. You are agreeing to surrender temporary custody of the residence, your vehicles, and access to joint accounts. At your age, this leaves you in an extremely precarious position. Are you making this decision freely? I stood slowly. I gripped the table edge and let my knuckles whiten. A visible tremor that cost me nothing and earned me everything. The metallic taste of controlled adrenaline sat on my tongue like a coin. Yes, Your Honor, I whispered. I do not have the strength to fight anymore. I just want peace. A gavel does not just end a hearing. It stamps a receipt. And the receipt I needed required Lorraine's eager signature on every single line, across the aisle. Lorraine pressed the tissue to her mouth. I could see the corners of her lips curling upward behind the white fabric. Her perfume drifted across the courtroom, the same expensive scent she had worn into my office 5 days ago. The scent of a woman who believed she was watching her husband surrender the last of his dignity. The gavel cracked against the sounding block, and the sound echoed off the dark wood paneling like a gunshot in a cathedral. Temporary order granted as requested, Judge Hargrove announced. All terms effective immediately. Lorraine's attorney gathered his papers with brisk satisfaction. Lorraine stood, smoothed her gray dress, and walked out of the courtroom without looking at me. She had fought for temporary control of every asset, every account, every square foot of the house, and the court had just granted it all. She believed she was winning a fortune. She did not know she was claiming a landmine, and the timer had already started counting down. 2 days later, Sterling's forensic team would crack open the first layer of Wade Kingsley's offshore empire, and what they found would make the mortgage fraud look like pocket change. While Lorraine celebrated her courtroom victory with wine in the house she believed was now hers, I sat in room 12, waiting for a message I knew was coming. It arrived on day 7, a single encrypted word from Sterling Prescott. Urgent. He was not a man who used that word. In 2 meetings across 2 days, he had delivered the news of my brother's death, a $500 million inheritance, and the identity of my son's executive terminal without once raising his voice above a measured baritone. So when I walked into the 40th floor conference room and saw what was glowing on the wall monitors, I understood immediately that the scale of what we were facing had just changed. Transaction flowcharts filled 3 screens. Blue lines connecting nodes like a circulatory system drawn in light. Sterling stood beside the largest monitor with a laser pointer and began. 4 shell entities so far, he said. All registered in the Cayman Islands within 6 weeks of Kingsley's appointment as executive director. Each company has been billing Ashcombe Manufacturing for consulting services, environmental compliance reviews, structural safety audits, supply chain optimization. The invoices are pristine. But the companies have no employees, no offices, and no operational history. They are paper facades designed to receive money and forward it offshore. I studied the flowcharts in silence. Through the adjacent wall, I could hear the rapid keystrokes of forensic analysts processing data I had not yet seen. How much? I asked. Through these 4 entities alone, approximately $3.8 million over 8 months. I had spent 38 years reading blueprints, load-bearing calculations, stress tolerances, structural weak points. Now I was reading a different kind of blueprint, one drawn in wire transfers and phantom invoices, and it told the same story every failing structure tells. Someone had been hollowing out the foundation while the rest of us stood on top. I leaned forward and traced the flowchart with my finger. The source accounts on every phantom invoice originated from the same 2 departmental budgets, engineering and manufacturing operations. My departments, the ones Wade had gutted over the past 8 months under the banner of cost reduction. Look at the dates, I said. Every budget cut he imposed on my department corresponds exactly with an inflated invoice from one of these phantom vendors. The salary reductions, the project cancellations, the staff transfers. None of it was cost optimization. He was creating cover for the extraction. Every dollar he cut from my people was rerouted through these shells and deposited offshore. Sterling turned from the monitor, his coffee untouched on the credenza. "The forensic team agrees with your analysis," he said. "The routing pattern suggests these four entities are only the first cluster. There are at least a dozen more operating through different jurisdictions. Bermuda, British Virgin Islands, possibly Luxembourg. If the pattern holds across all departments Kingsley restructured, the total exposure could be significantly higher." "How much higher?" "We may be looking at 8 figures. 3.8 million through 4 shells. And Sterling believed there were at least a dozen more hiding in the dark. The man who had stood in my doorway telling me to disappear quietly had not just been stealing from the company. He had turned the company into a machine designed to feed his offshore accounts, and he had used the departments I built as the input valve. I stood instead of sitting. Sitting felt too passive for what I was about to say. "Find every single shell, every jurisdiction, every routing number, every dollar he has touched since the day he was appointed. I want the full architecture mapped before he has any reason to suspect we are looking." Sterling made a note in his portfolio. And Sterling traced the connection between these offshore accounts and the Delaware intermediary we found on day 2. "If my son's terminal fed money into the same pipeline that Wade is using to drain the company, I need to know." He nodded. He understood what I was not saying. If the trails converged, it would mean my son had not just forged a single mortgage. It would mean he was embedded in the infrastructure of a theft that could reach tens of millions. 4 shells. 3.8 million. And Sterling's team was certain this was only the outermost layer, somewhere beneath the surface. Wade had built a machine designed to bleed my company dry, and the deeper we dug, the closer we would get to the one connection I dreaded most. The link between those offshore accounts and my son. 5 days later, Garrett would sit across from me in a diner and show me exactly how far a son's loyalty can fall. Sterling's forensic team was still digging through the offshore architecture, and the trail was inching closer to my son's name with every layer they peeled back. But I could not wait for the full picture. On day 12, I had an appointment with Garrett himself. I paid for my son's entire education so he would never know what it felt like to beg. And 12 days after the ambush, I sat across from him in a greasy diner and begged for $2,500 I did not need. The diner sat on the industrial west side of Columbus, the kind of place that served burnt coffee to freight workers and asked no questions. Rain hammered the plate glass window. The vinyl booth was cracked and the laminate table was sticky under my trembling fingers. A trimmer I manufactured with the same precision I had once applied to load calculations. Garrett Ashford, 42, my only son, slid into the opposite booth, radiating impatient disgust. He was impeccably groomed in a charcoal suit that cost more than my motel room would charge for 3 months. His cologne cut through the diner grease like a blade through wet paper. He set his phone face up on the table before he even looked at me. "I just need a temporary loan." "Garrett," I said, keeping my voice thin and unsteady. $2,500. First and last month on a studio apartment. The motel is not safe. The lock on my door is broken. You are my son. I have nowhere else to turn." He did not look up from his phone for the first 15 seconds. When he finally raised his eyes, his expression carried the bored pity of a man watching a stranger fumble with change at a checkout counter. "Dad, you have to be realistic," he said. "The market is volatile. My portfolio took a hit last quarter. You stagnated for 40 years at a drafting table, while everyone else moved up. You cannot expect me to bail you out because of your own lack of ambition." I looked beneath the table. $3,000 Italian loafers, angled carefully away from the sticky floor. I looked at his throat. A $500 silk tie, knotted with the precision of a man who practiced in front of a mirror every morning. $2,500 was the price of his weekend bar tab, and he sat there looking his elderly father in the eye and told me he could not afford it. I paid every cent of his private schooling, every dollar of his university tuition, the down payment on his first home. I had built a financial ladder for this man rung by rung since the day he was born, and he used my lifelong sacrifice as the very reason to justify leaving me on the street. The waitress refilled my coffee without being asked. The cup was thin ceramic, the coffee bitter and acidic, and I wrapped both hands around it because the warmth gave my manufactured trembling something to anchor against. Then Garrett checked his watch, and his demeanor shifted. The bored contempt drained from his face, replaced by something harder, more focused. He reached beneath the table and produced a designer briefcase I had not noticed him carry in. "Make it quick, Dad. I have a strategy meeting in 45 minutes. He did not even ask how I was doing. He unlatched the briefcase, pulled out a thick manila folder, and slid it across the greasy table toward me. Not a check. Not a loan agreement. A legal document. "I am not here to lend you money," he said. And for the first time, his voice carried urgency rather than disdain. "I am here because you are dragging your feet on the property division. Mom is suffering. Her mental health is hanging by a thread because you are being stubborn about the house." He leaned forward. The cologne intensified. "The title company requires your physical signature on this specific waiver to release the deed into her sole possession. Sign it and this can all be over." I looked at my son's eyes and saw something I had not seen before. Not contempt, not boredom, but naked, desperate greed. His pupils were dilated, his jaw was tight. His fingers pressed against the edge of the folder with the urgency of a man whose own finances depended on what happened in the next 5 minutes. This was not a son worried about his mother's mental health. This was a man with a massive personal stake in the outcome. And he needed my signature the way a drowning man needs a rope. Garrett unclipped a silver pen from his breast pocket and placed it directly on top of the documents. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that had nothing to do with Lorraine's well-being. He needed this signature. Not for his mother, not for closure, but for something buried inside those property records that he could not afford to let me discover. What I signed in that diner would become the final lock on the trap I was building around all three of them. Have you ever watched your own child rehearse a lie so poorly that every muscle in his face betrayed the script someone else had written for him? Garrett's silver pen sat on top of the deed waiver, and his eyes were locked onto mine with an urgency that had nothing to do with his mother's well-being. I looked down at the document and began to read slowly, the way a broken old man reads when his glasses are in his coat pocket and the fluorescent diner light is too dim for fine print. "Just sign it, Dad," Garrett said, his voice tightening. "The title company needs this by Friday, or the whole transfer stalls. Mom is living in that house alone. She deserves the security of knowing it is hers. Stop making this harder than it has to be." I turned to the second page. The language was standard residential deed waiver boilerplate until paragraph 7, where the transfer routing diverged. The property was not being released directly to Lorraine. It was being channeled through a secondary holding entity registered in Delaware. An intermediary with no name I recognized, inserted into a document that should have been a simple transfer between divorcing spouses. "Garrett?" I said, keeping my voice thin and confused. "Why does a deed waiver between husband and wife route through a holding company in Delaware? That is not how residential property transfers work." His jaw tightened. His fingers pressed against the edge of the folder, hard enough to bend the cardboard. "It is a standard legal structure," he said. "The attorneys recommended it for tax purposes. You would not understand the details. Just sign it and I will handle the rest." What kind of attorney recommends routing a residential deed waiver through a Delaware holding company for tax purposes? And what kind of son expects his 70-year-old father to be too broken to notice? I knew exactly what that Delaware entity was. Sterling's forensic team had already flagged Delaware intermediaries in the offshore architecture they were mapping. This was not a tax shelter. It was a funnel, the same kind of financial pipe that had carried the stolen mortgage funds out of my son's terminal and into accounts I had not yet fully traced. And now Garrett was trying to route the property deed through the same infrastructure. But I could not let him know I understood any of that. The broken man in the motel with the trembling hands would not recognize a Delaware holding entity if it bit him. The broken man would sign. So I picked up the silver pen. It was still warm from Garrett's pocket, and the weight of it felt obscene against my cold fingers. A pen that cost more than the diner's weekly revenue, placed in the hands of a man pretending to have nothing. I signed the waiver the way a man signs his own death certificate. Slowly, deliberately, with a hand that shook just enough to look authentic. I was not surrendering the house. I was sanding my son the rope and watching him tie his own noose. I had built bridges for 38 years, load-tested every beam, stress-calculated every joint, and I could see the structural failure in my son's composure as clearly as a hairline crack in a support column. Visible to anyone not trained to look. Catastrophic once the weight shifted. The moment my signature dried on the page, Garrett moved with a speed that erased every pretense of casual concern. He snatched the document from the table, stuffed it into his briefcase with hands that fumbled the latches twice, and stood without a word. No goodbye. No question about whether I had eaten. No glance back at the father he had just manipulated in a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and old frying oil. The briefcase latches snapped shut. His chair scraped against the linoleum. The heavy glass door slammed behind him, letting in a gust of wet asphalt and rain. Through the rain-streaked window, I watched my son practically sprint to his BMW parked on the gravel. Whatever debt he carried, it was heavy enough to strip every last trace of decency from his bones. I sat alone in the booth. The silver pen lay on the sticky table where he had forgotten it. My cold coffee sat untouched. The metallic taste of adrenaline lingered on my tongue, sharp and familiar. Garrett's BMW fishtailed out of the gravel lot, rear lights smearing red through the rain. I watched until the taillights disappeared, and I understood with absolute clarity that my son had not come to help his mother or punish his father. He had come because someone owned him, and the deed waiver was the price of whatever leash they held. My son walked into the slaughterhouse, and he did not even know who was holding the blade. 3 weeks ago I had a key to this door. Now I stood on my own welcome mat and rang the bell like a solicitor, rehearsing the tremor in my voice one last time before my wife answered. Garrett had fled that diner with the signed waiver clutched against his chest like stolen scripture. But the boy was merely a courier someone above him had drafted that document, and the Delaware entity it routed through would eventually tell me who. The door opened, and Lorraine appeared in cashmere and fresh lipstick, her expression calibrated to project the precise mixture of pity and inconvenience that a woman practices in the mirror before greeting the husband she is discarding. "Eugene, you look awful." She blocked the hallway with one manicured hand on the frame. "I told you to hire a real attorney instead of that bargain bin lawyer." "You are embarrassing yourself, and frankly, you are embarrassing me. By showing up looking like this." I kept my shoulders rounded and my eyes on the floor. The motel clothes helped. Wrinkled khakis, a jacket with a coffee stain I had placed there deliberately that morning. Every detail of this visit had been rehearsed 47 times in room 12 at the Railside Motor Lodge, timed with a stopwatch, optimized down to which hand would open which zipper. "I just need the coats, Lorraine. The motel room does not have heat after midnight. 5 minutes and I will be gone." She stepped aside with a sigh that could strip wallpaper. "Take whatever you need from the closet, but do not touch anything else. My attorney said everything in this house is under the temporary order now." I shuffled past her into the foyer of the home I had designed myself 31 years ago. The crown molding I had measured, the hardwood I had selected, board by board from a mill in Lancaster. She had already redecorated. New paint, new throw pillows on the sofa, sage green, replacing the burgundy ones we had chosen together on a Saturday in 2019. The shelves I had built by hand now held ceramic vases I had never seen. The lawn through the window was freshly manicured. Someone else was mowing it now. I moved toward the hall closet, counting steps. 14 to the closet door. 6 more to the living room sofa if the opportunity presented itself. The micro audio recorder sat in my left jacket pocket. No larger than a domino, military grade, with a 96-hour battery and a cellular uplink that would transmit every recorded conversation to an encrypted server Sterling had configured 2 days earlier. She turned her back on me to answer her phone ringing from the kitchen, and in the 3 seconds it took her to say hello, I planted the device that would eventually destroy her entire case. Left hand lifted the dust skirt beneath the sofa. Right hand pressed the recorder flat against the crossbar. The adhesive gripped. A green indicator pulsed once and went dark. I was standing at the closet pulling winter coats from hangers before Lorraine finished her first sentence. My mouth was chalk dry, the metallic edge of adrenaline sharp against my tongue. I pulled 3 coats I did not need from the rod, draped them over my arm, and walked back through the foyer with the posture of a man who had already surrendered everything. Thank you. Lorraine. She waved me off without looking up from her call. I could smell her perfume layered over fresh paint, the scent of a woman redecorating a life she believed she had already won. How many times had I walked down this driveway, carrying groceries, carrying Christmas presents, carrying my children when they were small enough to sleep against my shoulder. Now I walked it carrying surveillance equipment and the quiet certainty that this house would betray every secret whispered within its walls. The coat slipped from my arm as I passed the Cadillac Escalade gleaming white in the afternoon sun. Clumsy old man, trembling hands, perfectly natural. I bent down, reached beneath the rear bumper, and felt the magnets snap against cold steel. The click was barely audible. A small, precise sound, like the locking of a vault. 2 devices, 5 minutes. The surveillance network was live. I loaded the coats into the trunk of my rental and pulled away from the curb without looking back. In the rearview mirror, the house I had built with my own hands shrank to the size of a photograph. And inside it, a recorder no bigger than a domino was already listening. 48 hours. That was all it took. The very first conversation that device captured, the one I would hear played back on Sterling's laptop in a conference room overlooking the Scioto River, would be the recording that connected every thread I had been pulling since day 0. Wade, Garrett, the shell companies, and a number so large it would make the forged mortgage look like pocket change. Sterling Prescott had never asked me to come alone before. But when I arrived at the 40th floor on day 18, every forensic analyst had been sent home, and the conference room door was locked from the inside. The recorder I had planted 2 days earlier was already transmitting. But Sterling did not know that yet. What he had found through conventional forensics alone was enough to lock the door. "Sit down," he said. And for the first time since I had hired him, Sterling did not offer coffee. 3 wall monitors glowed behind him. I had expected numbers. I had expected charts. What I saw instead was a web 16 nodes pulsing red across a dark screen, connected by transaction arrows that crisscrossed like arterial bleeding. Cayman Islands, Bermuda, British Virgin Islands, 3 jurisdictions, 16 shell companies, and every single thread feeding into one central collection account that had no name, only a number. Sterling's reading glasses reflected the blue light of the monitors as he turned to face me. His baritone dropped low enough that I felt it in my sternum. 16 entities across 3 jurisdictions. $19.2 million in aggregate outflows. He let the figure settle. Every invoice bears the digital signature of a consulting firm that has no employees, no office, and no tax filings. Wade Kingsley has been running an extraction operation inside Ashcombe Manufacturing since the week he was appointed. $19 million. I had spent 38 years building that company, one rivet at a time, and Wade had dismantled it in 8 months with nothing more than forged invoices and a boardroom smile. The initial 4 shells Sterling had found on day 7 were a puddle. This was an ocean. I gripped the edge of the mahogany table until my knuckles whitened. He gutted my departments to create the cover. Every budget cut, every staff reduction, every project cancellation. It was not cost optimization. It was camouflage for the outflow. Correct. Sterling removed his glasses and set them on the table with a precision that told me the worst was still coming. But there is something else. Eugene, the rate of extraction has been accelerating over the last 60 days. He is not building a retirement fund. He is operating on a deadline. The ventilation hummed in the sealed room. I could smell warm electronics and the bitter residue of Sterling's black coffee. A glass of water sat in front of me, untouched. My mouth was dry, but I could not bring myself to reach for it. My hands were not steady enough to lift a glass without revealing the fury building behind my ribs. What deadline? Sterling touched his laptop and the display shifted. The 16 red nodes collapsed into a single funnel. And at the bottom of that funnel sat a consortium of purchasing entity registered in Delaware. The same Delaware intermediary. The same address that had appeared on the deed waiver Garrett had shoved across a diner table with trembling hands. It sat at the center of everything, connecting my son's signature to a conspiracy that dwarfed anything I had imagined. The extraction rate tells the story, Sterling said. At this pace, Ashcombe's operating accounts will be insolvent within 90 days. Wade is not stealing money to spend it. He is draining the company to force a distressed sale. And the buyer he has positioned to acquire it is registered through the same intermediary that appeared on your son's waiver. I leaned back in my chair and it creaked beneath me like a door opening onto a room I had never wanted to enter. The scope of it rearranged itself in my mind, not theft, but demolition. Wade was not picking the company's pockets. He was collapsing its foundations so he could buy the wreckage for pennies. He is not just stealing from the company, I said. He is killing it from the inside, bleeding it dry so he can buy the corpse for nothing. And your son's signature on that waiver was the final piece he needed to secure collateral for the acquisition financing. Sterling's voice was steady, but his jaw was tight. Garrett did not just betray you. He underwrote Wade's takeover without knowing what he signed. I stood and walked to the window. 40 stories below, the Scioto River caught the late afternoon light, indifferent and slow. My son had handed Wade the key to a kingdom he did not even know existed. And Wade, patient, methodical, smiling Wade, had 90 days left on a clock that nobody but Sterling and I could see. But neither of them knew about the recorder. Neither of them knew that beneath the sage green pillows in my living room, a device the size of a domino was already listening. And the first conversation it had captured would land on this very table within 48 hours. My wife and my business partner, in their own voices, discussing the exact date they planned to bury the company I had built with my hands. 15 of the 16 shell companies followed Wade's blueprint perfectly. Same formation agents, same jurisdictional routing, same phantom invoices, dressed in the language of consulting and compliance. But the 16th was different. And when Sterling pulled it onto the center monitor on day 20, he circled it with a laser pointer and said nothing for 10 seconds. That silence told me more than any report. The recording from my living room had arrived on his desk that morning, but we had not listened yet. The anomaly on the screen demanded attention first. This one does not belong to his playbook, Sterling said. He tapped his pen against the conference table in a slow rhythm that matched my pulse. 15 shells match Wade's signature, same formation, agent, same routing pattern, same offshore jurisdictions. But this 16th entity is a Nevada LLC, domestically registered. The fee it received was $740,000, labeled Executive Transition Services. Wade's other invoices are environmental, structural, supply chain. This invoice was written by someone else. The anomalous node pulsed amber against the blue offshore network on the screen. a single warm light in a constellation of cold ones. I rolled the pen between my fingers and stared at it. "Someone else is feeding at the same trough," I said. "Wade has a partner we have not identified. Someone close enough to know the invoice system, but operating through their own channel. 3 conspirators. I had already mapped my wife, my business partner, my son. And now the data was telling me there was a 4th. Someone skilled enough to bury their identity behind 3 layers of nominee directors while siphoning $740,000 through a single transaction. This was not an amateur skimming from the edges. This was a professional who had embedded themselves so deeply into the operation that even Wade's own financial architecture could not distinguish the parasite from the host. Sterling set down his pen. "My team is working to penetrate the nominee structure, but whoever built this entity knew exactly how to hide. We are looking at weeks before we can unmask the beneficial owner." "Weeks," I repeated. The word tasted like cold coffee, bitter and over-extracted, like the cup that had been sitting untouched at my elbow for the past hour. I did not have weeks. Wade's clock was ticking toward insolvency, and somewhere inside that 90-day window, a 4th conspirator was operating in shadow, collecting fees for services that would help destroy everything I had built. But the Nevada LLC was not the only weapon on the table. 2 days later, on a quiet Sunday morning in early May, I returned to Sterling's office with an order that made him set down his coffee and stare at me over the rim of his reading glasses. "The mortgage they forged against my house," I said. "The bank that holds it will sell distressed paper at a discount if approached correctly. I want Cornerstone Legacy Trust to acquire that debt. Quietly. No flags, no filings that connect back to my name until I am ready." Sterling leaned back. "You want to buy your own fraudulent mortgage. I want to own it. When they discover you hold the note, you will have the legal authority to foreclose on the property Lorraine just won in temporary court." They had forged that mortgage the way a blacksmith forges a blade, heating the metal in secret, hammering it into shape behind closed doors, stemming it with my son's stolen signature. And now I was going to buy that blade from the forge, sharpen it, and return it to the hands that made it. Edge first. "They built a weapon and aimed it at me," I said. My voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. And I heard it from outside myself, calm, unhurried, final. "I'm going to pick it up, turn it around, and pull the trigger at the moment of maximum impact. When they realize what happened, the debt will already be mine." Sterling studied me for a long moment, then opened his portfolio and began drafting the acquisition terms. The fresh printed pages were still warm from the laser printer. I could smell the toner mixing with black coffee. The scent of a Sunday morning spent building a trap from the wreckage of a betrayal. The Cornerstone acquisition would take days to execute. The Nevada LLC would take weeks to unmask. But I did not need Sterling's forensic team to find the 4th accomplice. The audio recorder beneath my living room sofa had been running for 5 days, capturing every conversation spoken in the house my enemies believed was theirs. Somewhere in those hours of recorded audio was a voice I had not yet identified, speaking freely, naming names. In a room they were certain no one was listening to. The tailor ran the measuring tape across my shoulders and said, "You carry yourself like a man who used to wear suits like this every day." I told him I was about to start again. The audio recorder had been running for 10 days now, and Sterling's team was still processing the transcripts. But I was done waiting in stained khakis for answers to arrive. It was time to build the version of myself that would walk into the room when the trap finally closed. The shop sat on a quiet block in the Short North Arts District, appointment only. No sign on the door. The kind of place where men paid cash for fabric that did not exist on any rack. The air smelled of fresh wool and cedar. The tailor. A lean man in his 60s, with a pincushion strapped to his wrist, circled me with the quiet efficiency of a surgeon prepping an incision. I chose charcoal. 3-piece, peak lapels. The fabric fell across my shoulders like armor. And when the tailor adjusted the vest, and stepped back with a nod of professional approval. I turned to the three-way mirror and met someone I had not seen in 25 days. For 25 days, I had worn frayed collars and coffee-stained jackets, shuffled through doorways with my head bowed, and let every person in my orbit believe I was a broken old man counting his last dollars in a motel room that smelled of disinfectant. The man in the mirror was not broken. He had been there the entire time, waiting behind the trembling hands and the manufactured stammer, patient as a coiled spring pressed flat against the floor. I looked at the reflection and saw my Uncle Howard staring back. The same jawline, the same cold composure, the same willingness to wait until the trap was perfect before springing it. Howard had built a fortune by letting his enemies underestimate him, and I had inherited more than his money. I had inherited his silence. The tailor pinned the last seam and told me the suit would be ready in 10 days. I paid from the trust's discretionary account cash. No receipt, no trail. This suit would be the last thing my enemies saw before the floor disappeared beneath them, and they would not recognize the man wearing it until it was far too late. 2 days later, on a Friday evening in early May, I sat in a rented sedan parked along the west bank of the Scioto River with binoculars on the passenger seat and my phone open to the GPS tracking application Sterling had configured. The dot representing Lorraine's Escalade pulsed steadily on the screen. It was not at Serenity Springs Wellness Center in Worthington, where her phone's location services claimed she was spending the weekend. Serenity Springs was 42 miles north of where her SUV was actually parked, and the glass I was about to watch her raise was not part of any recovery program I had ever heard of. The GPS dot sat motionless at Miranova Condominiums. Unit 1204. Wade Kingsley's registered address. I raised the binoculars. The evening light was fading over Columbus, painting the riverfront towers in shades of copper and ash. On the 12th floor balcony, 2 figures stood against the glass railing. I adjusted the focus, and the shapes sharpened into the woman I had been married to for 44 years, and the man who had systematically dismantled my career, drained the company I had built, and engineered a divorce designed to leave me destitute. Lorraine wore a black dress I had never seen. Wade stood beside her in shirt sleeves, one hand resting on the small of her back with the casual ownership of a man who had been touching her that way for months. She tilted her crystal flute toward his. They clinked. They laughed. The sound carried faintly across the water, thin and distant, like something breaking very far away. They were celebrating. They believed the old man was finished sleeping in a $40 motel room with no heat, too proud to beg and too broken to fight. They were toasting the destruction of a man they had already buried in their minds. I lowered the binoculars and set them on the passenger seat. The river air drifted through the cracked window, cool and mineral sharp. My phone vibrated against my thigh. A text from Sterling. 2 words and a file attachment. Transcript ready. I opened the attachment. The audio recorder's first full harvest hours of conversation, captured in the living room they believed was private. I scrolled to the timestamp Sterling had flagged. And before I read a single word of the transcript, I saw the header notation his analyst had added 3 speakers identified. All confirmed. The progress bar crawled across the screen at 11%, and I sat on the edge of a motel bed that cost $40 a night, waiting to hear every secret my family had whispered in the house I built for them. Sterling's preliminary analysis had flagged the timestamp, but not transcribed a single word of it. The truth was somewhere in these files. 14 days of audio, 336 hours. I plugged the encrypted receiver into the secure laptop Sterling had provided and let the download run. The first hours were nothing. Lorraine on the phone with her sister discussing kitchen countertops, the television cycling through daytime talk shows, the cleaning service running a vacuum directly over the microphone every Tuesday morning, filling my headphones with a roar that made me flinch. I fast-forwarded through the mundane architecture of a life that no longer included me, logging timestamps on a yellow legal pad. searching for the frequency shift that would tell me a conversation worth hearing had begun. I almost missed it. The instant coffee on the nightstand had gone cold hours ago, bitter and over-extracted, and the motel radiator ticked in the silence between playback segments like a metronome counting down to something I could not yet see. I had spent 38 years listening to the sounds a building makes before it fails the groan of overloaded steel, the whisper of concrete fracturing under pressure. Now I was listening to the sound of a family collapsing, recorded in crystal clarity by a device no larger than a domino. The timestamp read, Day 27, 8:47 p.m. 2 hours after I had watched Lorraine raise a champagne flute on Wade's balcony across the river. She was home again. The audio quality shifted. Footsteps on hardwood. The front door opening. And then her voice changed. The pitch rose. The words came faster, and I heard the click of expensive shoes on the floor I had installed 2 decades ago. Wade Kingsley was in my house. Everything is on schedule, Lorraine said. The recording was so clean I could hear ice cubes settling in a glass. The attorney says the final decree will be rubber-stamped within 60 days. Everything transfers to me automatically. Good. Wade's voice was measured, boardroom precise, even in my living room. I heard him settle into something leather cushions compressing under his weight. The sofa. He was sitting directly above the microphone. The timeline is tight. I need the insolvency filing submitted before the August board meeting or the acquisition window closes. Is Garrett handling the property transfer on schedule? I gripped the coffee mug between both hands and felt the ceramic cool against my palms. They were discussing the company's murder and my financial annihilation with the same casual efficiency I had once used to review production schedules. Lorraine laughed at something Wade said, next a light, easy laugh. The laugh of a woman who believes she was sharing a private joke in a private room. They sat on the sofa I had bought for our 30th anniversary. The one Lorraine had picked out at the showroom on Sawmill Road. The one she had spent 3 weekends choosing because the shade of burgundy had to match the curtains I had hung for her. And they did not know that every word they spoke was being captured 6 inches beneath the cushions they were sitting on. 20 minutes into the recording, the front door opened again. New footsteps, heavier, faster. The stride of someone arriving with purpose. I heard Lorraine's voice brighten. There he is. The laptop speakers were small and tinny, but my son's voice cut through with a clarity that made the hair on my arms stand upright. I recognized his cadence before the first syllable finished, the same rushed excitement he had carried as a boy running into the kitchen to show me a school project. Repurposed now for something that would have made the boy I raised recoil in shame. I have excellent news, Garrett said. The sofa cushions compressed. He had sat down between them, my wife on one side, my business partner on the other. My son. In the middle, 3 people arranged on the furniture of a life I had paid for, preparing to discuss how they planned to finish destroying the man who had built every wall around them. I paused the recording. The green waveform froze on the screen. Mid-syllable. Garrett's voice suspended in digital amber. The motel room was silent except for the radiator and my own breathing. I stared at the frozen waveform and understood that the next 11 minutes of this recording would change everything because my son was about to explain, in his own voice, exactly what he had done. I have heard machinery fail. The scream of a turbine throwing a blade at 3,000 revolutions per minute. The groan of a structural beam splitting under a load it was never designed to carry. But no sound in 38 years of engineering had ever been as violent as my son's laughter coming through that laptop speaker. I pressed play on the frozen waveform and let the recording run. Wade spoke first. His voice filled the motel room with the polished confidence of a man conducting a board meeting. Except this meeting was being held on my sofa, in my house, over drinks poured from my bar. I have to hand it to you. Garrett, the signature extraction was exceptional work. The bank's authentication team flagged nothing. Even their forensic verification came back clean. You have a genuine talent for this. I leaned forward on the edge of the bed. The laptop screen glowed in the dark room, the green waveform spiking with each syllable. My son's voice came next, and it carried the eager energy of a student presenting his thesis to a professor he wanted desperately to impress. It was not difficult once I had access to the archived project authorizations on the executive terminal. Dad signed thousands of documents over 40 years. The digital pattern library was enormous. I matched the pressure variance, the timing drift, everything. The funds cleared in 72 hours without a single hold. Not difficult. My son had cloned my digital signature from documents I had signed to build bridges, approve safety protocols, authorize the manufacturing systems that kept 400 families employed, and he described the forgery as not difficult. He had sat at my old terminal at 2 in the morning and dissected my life's work into data points, harvested my identity like a crop, and fed it into a machine designed to steal everything I had built. Then Lorraine laughed. My wife of 44 years laughed, and the sound came through the tinny laptop speaker with a warmth and ease that told me she had been laughing exactly like this for months in my house, on my sofa, about my ruin. He spent 40 years signing papers to build that company, she said, and his own signature is what we used to take the house out from under him. There is a beautiful irony in that, is there not? Wade chuckled. Garrett laughed. Ice cubes clinked in glasses. 3 people sharing a joke in a room they believed was safe, celebrating the systematic destruction of the man who had paid for the roof above their heads and the floor beneath their feet. I pressed pause. Not because I needed to stop gathering evidence. Not because the recording quality had faltered or the timestamp required logging. I pressed pause because the sound of my only child laughing while describing how he forged my signature was a frequency I was not built to absorb. I had prepared for betrayal. I had steeled myself for cruelty, for contempt, for the cold mechanics of greed. I had not prepared for joy. Their joy bright, easy, shared at my annihilation. I had calculated every variable, anticipated every move, prepared for every possible configuration of treachery. But no formula exists for the moment you hear your child describe dismantling your life and call it not difficult. The motel room went silent. The radiator ticked. The laptop fan pushed warm air across my knuckles. My reflection stared back at me from the dark border of the screen, a 70-year-old man, sitting alone in a room that smelled of stale coffee and musty carpet. Tears running down his face, for the first time in 25 days of performed weakness. These tears were not performed. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and tasted salt at the corner of my mouth. The paused timestamp read 9:03 p.m. 7 minutes of recording remained. 7 minutes that Sterling's preliminary analysis had flagged as containing the 4th speaker. The voice that did not belong to Lorraine, Wade, or Garrett. Somewhere in those final minutes was a name I needed. A name that would complete the map of everyone who had conspired to destroy me. I sat in the dark and asked myself the only question that mattered. Could I finish listening to this recording and still do what needed to be done? Could I take the sound of my son's laughter and file it alongside the forensic data and the offshore account numbers and the forged signatures? Reduce it to evidence. Strip it of the 42 years of birthday candles and bedtime stories and school plays that made it unbearable. I pressed my thumb against the spacebar and held it there without pushing down. The waveform waited, frozen, patient. 7 minutes. One more name. No more room for grief after this, only war. I pressed play. What does it cost a man to sit perfectly still and listen to his own family plan his funeral before he is dead? I pressed play and the final 7 minutes began. The grief I had felt moments ago. The tears. The shaking. Hands settled into something denser. Something that pressed against the inside of my chest like ballast dropped into the hull of a ship. Lorraine spoke first. Her recorded voice carried the careful tone of a woman reviewing logistics, not conspiracies. But what happens when the mortgage actually defaults? He cannot pay. He is living in a motel. Will they come after me for the balance? Wade answered with the clinical patience of a man who had rehearsed this explanation. The mortgage is in his name only. Garrett made certain of that. When it defaults, the bank forecloses on him personally. His credit is destroyed, his assets are frozen, and since his attorney does not know about the inheritance, no one will think to shield it. He will be financially erased within 90 days. And by then, the divorce will be finalized. Garrett added, "The company acquisition will be complete, and Dad will have nothing left to fight with, even if he wanted to." They had drawn a blueprint for my destruction as carefully as I had ever drawn a blueprint for a bridge. Load calculations, stress tolerances, failure points. Except the structure they were engineering to collapse was not concrete and steel. It was my life, my name, my ability to exist as a functioning person in a society that measures a man by what he owns. They had sequenced every phase: the forged mortgage to trigger default, the divorce to strip assets, the insolvency filing to kill the company, and the acquisition to scoop up the remains. Every piece interlocked, every timeline synchronized, every contingency addressed, except the one sitting in a $40 motel room listening to every word. Then Lorraine asked the question that changed everything. And if he finds out, if he somehow discovers what we have done, what then? Before I tell you what my son said next, are you still with me? Comment your honest reaction in one word, just one word for what you are feeling right now. Please note what follows contains some details adapted for narrative impact. The message behind it is what matters. The recording hissed softly for 2 seconds. I could hear Garrett shift on the sofa cushion. The leather compressed. A glass was set down on the coffee table, and when he spoke, his voice carried the dismissive certainty of a man stating the weather forecast. "Mom, be realistic. Dad is 70 years old with a heart condition he thinks nobody knows about. The stress of the divorce, the mortgage default, losing the company. His body will solve the problem for us. It is just a matter of time. Nature will do what we do not have to." My son knew about my heart, a diagnosis I had shared with no one, told to no doctor outside a private clinic in Worthington, written in no file that any attorney or employer had ever accessed. Garrett knew, and he was counting on it to kill me. He had factored my death into the timeline the way an engineer factors material fatigue into a stress model, not as a tragedy, but as a variable with a predictable outcome. "To nature, then," Wade said. 3 glasses clinked through the laptop speaker. The sound was small and bright crystal touching crystal. A toast made in my living room, on my sofa, over my grave. They were not celebrating a business deal. They were not marking a milestone. My wife, my son, and my business partner raised their glasses and drank to the moment when the accumulated weight of their betrayal would stop my heart. And they laughed the way people laugh at the end of a long dinner when the check has been paid and the evening has been pleasant. I removed the headphones and set them on the nightstand beside the cold coffee. The pressure marks lingered on my ears. My mouth was completely dry. Tongue pressed against the roof of my mouth. No saliva, no taste, nothing. The motel room was silent. Perfectly, completely silent. The radiator had stopped ticking. The laptop fan had cycled down. Even the highway noise outside the window seemed to have withdrawn, as if the world itself had stepped back to give me room. I sat in that silence for a long time. The man who had pressed play 20 minutes ago no longer existed. He had died somewhere between the sound of his son's laughter and the clink of 3 champagne glasses. In his place sat someone who did not grieve, someone who planned. The face in the bathroom mirror was not the man who had checked into room 12 30 days ago. And I did not want it to be. The fluorescent tube above the sink buzzed and flickered, casting my reflection in stuttering light gaunt. Sleepless. 70 years old and stripped of every illusion I had carried into this room. I gripped the cold porcelain edge of the sink with both hands and conducted a funeral. The husband who had loved Lorraine for 44 years, dead. The father who had forgiven Garrett every cruelty, every dismissal, every sneer disguised as ambition, dead. The engineer who had trusted Wade Kingsley with his professional legacy, dead. 3 funerals in a motel bathroom under a dripping faucet. No mourners, no flowers, no grief. I splashed cold water on my face and tasted the metallic tang of old pipes on my lips. What stood in their place was something none of them had ever met. A man with concealed assets they could not imagine. Recorded confessions they did not know existed. A forensic team mapping every stolen dollar across 3 offshore jurisdictions. Absolutely nothing left to lose. They had raised their glasses to my death, and in that single toast, they severed every obligation I had ever felt to protect them from what I was capable of becoming. I pressed the rough motel towel against my face and held it there. The mildew smell of the fabric mixed with cheap soap. When I lowered it, the man in the mirror looked back at me, with an expression I recognized from old photographs of Howard. Not anger, not sorrow, but the flat, patient calm of someone who has already decided what happens next and is simply waiting for the clock to arrive at the correct hour. I turned off the bathroom light and walked back into room 12 as someone new. The old version of me was a good man. The man who replaced him was not good. He was necessary. 2 days passed. I spent them reviewing Sterling's forensic reports, cross-referencing the shell company timelines against the audio transcripts, and mapping the sequence of my counterattack against the insolvency deadline that was now fewer than 60 days away. On Monday morning, my burner phone vibrated on the nightstand. The number was unknown. The message was encrypted. I opened it and read the words 3 times before my hands stopped shaking. And this time, the shaking was not from grief. In 32 days, my wife had betrayed me. My son had forged my name and toasted my death. And my business partner had orchestrated the theft of everything I had built. And now the quietest person in my family, the one I had underestimated for years, was the only one who had chosen to be human. Celine Ashford, 36. Garrett's soft-spoken wife and the mother of his infant daughter, had reached through the darkness on a phone her husband did not know she owned. Dad, I am using a phone Garrett does not know about. I cannot say much. I know what he is doing. I have seen documents on his laptop that frighten me. I do not stand with him. My daughter deserves a grandfather, not a gravestone. Please be careful. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the glowing screen. The room smelled of stale carpet and the faint chemical trace of bleach from the sink I had just cleaned. The phone was warm in my palm, and Celine's words pulsed on the screen like a heartbeat in a body I had assumed was dead. A second message arrived 30 seconds later. There is something else. Garrett has been meeting with someone I do not recognize. Not Wade, someone older. I overheard a phone call last week. Garrett called him by a name I had never heard before. I will try to find out more. The 4th accomplice. The one behind the anomalous invoice. The one hiding behind 3 layers of nominee directors in a domestic shell that did not match Wade's offshore pattern. Celine had heard his name. She was inside the house, inside the marriage, close enough to the conspiracy to see its edges, and she had chosen my side. The third message was shorter. The words arrived in fragments, typed fast. I have to go. The baby just woke up. The screen went dark. I held the phone in both hands and listened to the silence of room 12. No radiator, no highway noise, just the dripping faucet behind me, marking time. If Garrett discovered what his wife had just done, she and the baby would be exposed before I could reach them. Celine had handed me the thread that could unravel the 4th accomplice, and the price of pulling it might be her safety. Sterling called at 7 in the morning on day 35, with 2 words I had not expected to hear for months. Nora Ballard. I had arranged secure communication with Celine 3 days earlier through a prepaid phone delivered by courier to a neighbor she trusted. But this was a different thread entirely. One I had written off on day 0 when the phone line went dead mid-sentence. "She called my office this morning," Sterling said. "She has been building a file since the day her call was disconnected. Authentication logs, internal audit flags, routing records, a complete chain of custody for every document related to the fraudulent mortgage." The bank's own compliance division corroborated the fraud independently. I set down my coffee. "Her call was cut off on day 0. I assumed they had silenced her, reassigned her, threatened her, buried the report." "They tried. She said they reassigned her, restricted her access, and suggested early retirement. She declined. She has been working on her own for 5 weeks. They had disconnected her phone and assumed that silence meant compliance. How many times had these people mistaken quiet for surrender? They had mistaken mine. They had mistaken Celine's. And now, Nora Ballard, a woman I had spoken to for less than 90 seconds before the line was severed, had spent 5 weeks building a parallel evidence trail through official bank channels, creating documentation that was legally admissible because it had been gathered through the institution's own audit process. I met her at Sterling's office that afternoon. She walked into the conference room carrying a banker's box that she set on the mahogany table with the careful precision of a woman who understood exactly what was inside it. She was in her late 50s, silver-haired, dressed in a charcoal blazer that matched the no-nonsense efficiency of her handshake. 31 years in banking compliance had given her the posture of someone who did not bluff. She removed the lid with a papery scrape and began laying out tabbed folders in a row. The scent of fresh paper and cardboard mixed with Sterling's coffee and Nora's understated perfume. Each folder was labeled, dated, and cross-referenced. "I have the full authentication chain," she said. Her voice was steady, professional, and never wavered. "Terminal ID, timestamp, digital signature hash, all matching your son's executive credentials. The funds routed through the same Delaware intermediary that appears on the other transactions Mr. Prescott's team has mapped. This is not circumstantial. This is a direct documented trail from forgery to offshore deposit." Nora Ballard had walked into Sterling's office carrying a box that weighed no more than 20 pounds. But inside it was the detonator for an explosion that would level 3 careers, 1 marriage, and an empire built on forged signatures and phantom invoices. Every page she laid on that table was another brick in a wall that my enemies would never climb over. "The bank tried to close my investigation 3 times, she continued, lifting a thick folder from the bottom of the box. "I have 31 years in compliance, and I have never seen fraud this coordinated or this reckless. I am prepared to testify in federal court." She looked at me directly, and her eyes held the flat certainty of a person who had already calculated the cost. "But I need to know, how do you intend to use this?" I poured black coffee from Sterling's carafe and took a slow sip. The taste was strong and bitter and exactly right. "I intend to use it exactly once. Ms. Ballard, at the moment when every person who participated in this conspiracy is seated in the same room, with no exit and no warning, your testimony will not be a warning shot. It will be the kill shot." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded once, before she left. Nora placed one more item on the table, a handwritten note face down on the polished surface. She slid it across to me with 2 fingers. "There is something else you should know. The Delaware intermediary received a second transfer 10 days ago. Not from your son's terminal this time. From an account I have never seen before. Registered to a name I did not recognize." I pressed the note flat with my fingertips and turned it over. A single name, written in neat block letters on lined paper. My throat tightened. The coffee turned to ash in my mouth. It was the same name Celine had overheard on Garrett's phone call, the older man. the one who did not match any face in Wade's network. The fourth accomplice had a name now, and it connected the anomalous invoice. The second Delaware transfer, and a thread that reached deeper into my company than I had ever imagined. On day 38, I signed a single document that turned a weapon aimed at my chest into a loaded gun pointed at every person who had built it. The name on Nora's handwritten note had confirmed what Celine overheard: a fourth accomplice, embedded inside Ashcombe Manufacturing itself. Someone who had been operating in Wade's shadow for over a decade. But that revelation would have to wait. The mortgage came first. Sterling slid the trust authorization across the conference table, and I signed with deliberate pressure, the pen scratching across heavy legal paper in the quiet of the 40th floor. "The acquisition is complete," Sterling said. "Cornerstone Legacy Trust now holds the mortgage note in full." The bank accepted the discounted purchase without question. They were eager to clear the flagged asset from their books. "As of this morning, you were the sole creditor on the mortgage your son forged against your name." I set the pen down and let the weight of it settle. They had built this instrument to destroy me. A fraudulent debt designed to trigger default, annihilate my credit, and render me permanently insolvent. My son had cloned my signature to create it. My wife had claimed the house it was attached to. My business partner had routed the proceeds offshore. And now every dollar of that debt belonged to me. My son had forged that mortgage, the way an amateur builds a pipe bomb dangerous enough to wound, sloppy enough to leave fingerprints on every component. I had just purchased that bomb from the evidence locker, diffused it, and wired it to a detonator only I controlled. When I called the debt, Lorraine would receive a foreclosure notice on the property she had fought to claim in court. And the signature on the original application would trace directly back to the executive terminal where Garrett had sat at 2 a.m, harvesting my identity. "The irony is architecturally perfect," Sterling said. He removed his glasses and set them on the table, a gesture I had learned to recognize as the prelude to bad news. "But we need to discuss timing, because something has changed on Wade's end." 4 days later, on a Friday morning that smelled of cold coffee and leather portfolio binding, Sterling showed me what had changed. His monitors displayed shell account access logs updating in real time, and 3 of the 16 accounts had new authorization codes that had not existed 48 hours earlier. "Wade changed the access codes on 3 shell accounts yesterday," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a register I had not heard from him before. "He has restricted internal financial reporting at Ashcombe to executive level only and canceled 2 scheduled board briefings. He knows someone is looking. He does not know who, but he is preparing to move." 42 days of careful, patient construction, and now Wade was changing locks, canceling meetings, and preparing to run. Which meant I had less than 10 days to deploy every weapon I had built or watch the stolen millions disappear into jurisdictions that would never give them back. "How much time before he can relocate the offshore assets beyond our reach?" I asked. "If he moves aggressively, he could transfer the remaining funds through secondary jurisdictions by next Friday. Once that money crosses into those accounts, the forensic trail becomes exponentially harder to reconstruct." Sterling leaned forward, his forearms flat on the cool surface of the conference table. "If he moves assets before Friday, the evidence we have spent 42 days building could become legally unreachable." I picked up my coffee. It was bitter and strong, and I drank it slowly, feeling the metallic edge of urgency tighten at the back of my throat. Wade might not wait for the board meeting to move what was left. Every thread, the forensic map, the audio recordings, Nora's testimony, the mortgage acquisition. The fourth accomplice had to be ready before he could scatter the evidence across untraceable accounts in jurisdictions that did not cooperate with American courts. Sterling leaned across the table. "It is time to set the date." I opened my phone. The screen glowed warm in my palm. I typed a single message to Sterling, the fiduciary counsel, who had been quietly preparing the legal architecture since the first week, and told him to file everything on Monday morning. The courtroom, the evidence, the federal referral, all of it converging in a single room on a single day. The message sent with a soft chime that sounded in the silence of the 40th floor. Like the first note of something that had been building for 42 days. None of them would see it coming. None of them would have time to run. And by the time the door closed behind them, every weapon they had forged against me would be aimed back at their own heads. 60 days. That is how long it takes to dismantle a 44-year marriage when one side has already decided not to fight. The filings went out on Monday as planned. The legal machinery ground forward on schedule. And on a gray morning in late June, I walked into the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas, wearing the same wrinkled khakis and stained jacket I had worn to every hearing since this began. The bespoke suit hung in a garment bag in the trunk of my rental car. Today was not its day. Judge Hargrove sat behind the bench with the weary patience of a woman who had seen 1,000 marriages end on her watch. Lorraine sat across the aisle in a cream blazer, her attorney's table stacked with documents. My low-cost attorney sat beside me and offered nothing. No objections, no counterclaims, no motions of any kind. That was by design. "Mr. Ashford," the judge said, "the court is prepared to finalize this decree. You are surrendering all marital assets, including the family home, joint accounts, retirement funds, and all vehicles registered in both names. Your counsel has filed no objections and no counterclaims. Do you understand the permanence of this decision?" "I understand, Your Honor." The gavel struck. The sound cracked through the courtroom like a bone breaking clean. Lorraine exhaled with visible relief, the deep, settling breath of a woman who had just been awarded everything she wanted. She had won the house with a mortgage I now owned through a trust she would never trace. She had won accounts that would be frozen by federal order within 72 hours. She had won a retirement fund already flagged as proceeds of a conspiracy that spanned 3 offshore jurisdictions. She walked out of that courtroom smiling, and she had no idea she had just claimed a building wired to explode. I descended the courthouse steps slowly, gripping the smooth stone railing, letting the rain soak through my collar. The June air was warm and heavy and smelled of wet stone and exhaust. At the curb, a silver Porsche idled with its wipers beating time. Wade sat behind the wheel. Lorraine climbed into the passenger seat and closed the door without looking back. Garrett leaned out the rear window, rain speckling his suit jacket, and the grin on his face carried the specific cruelty of a man who believes he has already won and wants the loser to know it. "Hey, Dad." His voice carried across the rain with an ease that told me he had been rehearsing this. "Here is something for dinner tonight. Consider it a graduation gift from the School of Hard Knocks." He crumpled a $20 bill and tossed it. It tumbled through the rain in a slow arc and landed on the dark, wet concrete between my shoes. Lorraine leaned across from the passenger seat, laughing. "Garrett, do not be cruel. Your father did the right thing today." He finally admitted what we have known for years. He has nothing left to offer anyone. The $20 bill lay on the wet concrete, already darkening with rainwater. I looked at it and thought my son just threw $20 at a man who holds $500 million in concealed assets. And he did it from the back seat of a car purchased with stolen money. He threw it the way you throw a coin to a street musician, casually, without counting, because the amount means nothing to the person giving it. The Porsche pulled away from the curb. I watched its taillights blur through the rain and disappear around the corner on High Street. Garrett's laughter hung in the humid air for a moment after the engine sound faded, thin and hollow, like an echo in an empty room. I stood motionless on the courthouse steps. The rain ran down my face and into my collar. The crumpled 20 dissolved slowly into the puddle at my feet. A passing attorney glanced at me with the practiced sympathy people reserve for men they believe have lost everything, then looked away. I reached into my wet jacket and pulled out my phone. The screen was slick with rain. I dialed the number I had memorized on day 2 and held the phone to my ear. Sterling answered on the first ring. "Sterling," I said. "It is time." On the other end of the line, I heard a drawer slide open. I knew what was inside it. 60 days of forensic architecture, recorded confessions, federal witness testimony, and the complete anatomy of a conspiracy that had been designed to bury me. Sterling said one word back. Monday. I hung up, slipped the phone back into my jacket, and walked down the courthouse steps into the rain. The silver Porsche was long gone. They had no idea it was the last time all three of them would laugh together. The name on Nora's handwritten note, the name Celine had overheard on Garrett's phone, and the name behind the anomalous invoice were all the same, and it belonged to someone who had been sitting inside Ashcombe Manufacturing's own audit department for 11 years. Sterling had confirmed it overnight. The silver Porsche that had pulled away from the courthouse 2 days ago carried 3 conspirators. The fourth had been inside the walls the entire time. Clyde Farrell, 58 years old. Ashcombe Manufacturing's internal audit manager since I had personally approved his hiring over a decade ago. The man I had trusted to safeguard every dollar flowing through the company's accounts had been paid $740,000 through a Nevada LLC to ensure that no audit flag, no compliance review, and no board-level report ever revealed what Wade was doing. Sterling pulled Farrell's employee photograph onto the monitor beside the Nevada LLC registration documents. A broad face, wire-rimmed glasses. The kind of unremarkable appearance that made a man forgettable in a hallway and invaluable in a conspiracy. He did not just ignore the fraud, Sterling said. He redesigned the audit protocols to make it invisible. 16 separate flags that should have triggered board review were suppressed, reclassified, or routed to dead-end committees he controlled. Nora confirmed it from the banking side. The second transfer I flagged originated from Farrell's entity. He was not just receiving payment. He was actively routing funds through the same Delaware intermediary used for the mortgage forgery. He is embedded in the infrastructure of this conspiracy. 4 people. My wife, my son, my business partner, and the auditor I had personally hired to protect the company's integrity. Every layer of protection I had ever built had been turned against me from the inside. The conspiracy was not an attack from the outside. It was an autoimmune disease, my own body destroying itself. While the guardians I had appointed held the door open, I stood at the window and looked down at Columbus 40 stories below. The Scioto River caught the morning light, somewhere down there. Clyde Farrell was sitting at his desk in Ashcombe's finance wing, reviewing the same audit reports he had been falsifying for months. Unaware that his name was now written on a federal witness deposition and cross-referenced in a forensic dossier that would end his career and his freedom. That evening, I left the Railside Motor Lodge for the last time. Sterling had arranged a penthouse at the Levesque Tower through the trust 47 floors above the city. Clean lines, floor-to-ceiling glass, and the kind of silence that only altitude can provide. I rode the elevator up with nothing but a garment bag and a leather portfolio containing 62 days of evidence. The next 4 weeks were a sprint. Sterling arrived each morning with updated sections of the dossier embezzlement documentation across 16 shells. Audio recordings of 3 conspirators confessing in their own voices. Nora's deposition filed under seal, and Farrell's suppressed audit reports reconstructed from backup servers the company's IT department did not know Sterling's team had accessed. I reviewed every page at the penthouse dining table, turning heavy documents under my fingers until I knew every figure, every timestamp, every routing number by memory. Twice during that month, Sterling's monitors lit up with a wire attempt on one of the 16 shell accounts Wade testing the locks, probing for a way out before the trap sprang shut. Both times, Sterling's team flagged the transfer to the receiving bank's compliance desk before it could clear. And both times, Wade backed off within the hour, unaware that every attempt only added another timestamp to the case against him. I stood in the Levesque penthouse 47 floors above the streets I had walked as a broken man in stained khakis, and I pressed my palm against the cold window glass and looked down at the city where I had spent my entire career. The man who had shuffled through those streets no longer existed. He had been accustomed 89 days of performance. Every stumble choreographed, every tremor rehearsed, and I was about to take it off for the last time. On the final evening, Sterling delivered the hostile takeover papers prepared through Sovereign Peak Capital, the instrument through which my majority shareholding would be formally declared. I signed them at the dining table with a glass of single malt whiskey beside my hand. The first drink I had allowed myself in 89 days. It burned clean and amber. "The chessboard is set," Sterling said, watching me sign the last page. "The house, the company, the offshore accounts, every conspirator's professional license, all of it converges in one room, on one day. We are waiting for them to walk in and sit down." I collected the bespoke charcoal suit from the garment bag. The cedar and wool scent of the tailor's shop filled the penthouse as I unzipped it. I held the jacket against my shoulders and looked at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass silver hair. Steady hands, the cold composure of a man who had listened to his family toast his death and converted every ounce of that grief into architecture. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into the Ashcombe boardroom and take the seat at the head of the table. None of them would know why until the door locked behind them. I stood in the unlit service corridor behind the boardroom, the same corridor I had walked every day for 38 years, and listened to Wade Kingsley tell a room full of people that the company I built had never really been mine. The charcoal suit fit like armor. The briefcase in my hand held 90 days of evidence. I pressed my fingertips against the cool corridor wall and waited. Through the cracked service door, I watched Wade stand at the head of the polished table, where I had once sat and addressed the board, with the easy confidence of a man who believed he had already won. "Ashcombe Manufacturing has completed its transition from a founder-era management model to a modern corporate structure," he said. His voice carried the amplified warmth of a man delivering a eulogy for someone he had murdered. "Effective today, I am assuming the permanent role of executive director, with full operational and financial authority." Eugene Ashford's legacy was one of dedication. But dedication without vision is stagnation. And this company will no longer stagnate. 4 sentences. He erased 38 years of my life in 4 sentences. And the board members seated around that table nodded along like they were listening to a weather report. How many of them had attended my retirement dinner, shaken my hand, told me the company would not be the same without me? How many had looked me in the eye and promised that my legacy was safe, and now sat silently while the man who had drained the company's accounts told them I had never mattered? I am also pleased to announce the appointment of Garrett Ashford as Vice President of Global Finance. Wade continued. Garrett brings the energy, the strategic acumen, and frankly, the ambition that this company has lacked for decades. Together, we will take Ashcombe into its next chapter. Garrett stood beside Wade in a suit that probably cost more than his monthly salary had been before the embezzlement began. He shook Wade's hand with both of his own, the eager, two-handed grip of a protege who believed he had earned his promotion through merit rather than forgery. The board applauded. Coffee cups clinked on the credenza. The new carpet they had installed since my departure smelled of chemicals and fresh adhesive. In the VIP gallery above the main floor, Lorraine sat in a cream dress with a diamond necklace I had never seen catching the overhead lights. She applauded with both hands, genuine, unhurried applause. The sound of a woman celebrating the coronation of the man she had chosen over the husband who had given her 44 years. I wondered if she knew those diamonds had been purchased with money siphoned from the pension contributions of workers I had spent decades protecting. Clyde Farrell sat in the back row with a legal pad, dutifully recording minutes of a meeting that celebrated the very fraud he had been paid to conceal. His pen moved in steady strokes across the page. And he did not yet know that his name appeared on page 37 of the dossier in my briefcase cross-referenced with the Nevada LLC. The suppressed audit flags, and a federal witness deposition that would end his career before lunch. For one perfect, crystalline moment, all 4 of them believed they had won. Completely, permanently, without consequence. Wade at the head of the table. Garrett beside him, beaming. Lorraine in the gallery, diamonds glittering. Farrell in the back row, pen scratching. The room hummed with the satisfied energy of people who had divided a kingdom among themselves and could not imagine anyone arriving to contest the partition. I adjusted the single button on my charcoal jacket. I shifted the briefcase from my left hand to my right. I took one breath, controlled, measured, the last breath of the man who had been hiding for 90 days, and stepped out of the service corridor into the boardroom doorway. The room fell silent, one person at a time. Wade saw me first. His hand froze mid-gesture, suspended in the air like a conductor whose orchestra had stopped playing. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Garrett's champagne flute stopped halfway to his lips. Lorraine's applause died with her hands still raised, fingers spread, frozen in the posture of celebration. And Clyde Farrell looked up from his legal pad and went absolutely white. The color draining from his face the way it drains from a man who has just realized the door behind him is locked. I stood in the doorway and said nothing. The broken old man from the motel was gone. The stained khakis, the manufactured trimmer, the shuffling gait, all of it shed like a skin that had served its purpose and been discarded. In his place stood someone none of them had ever met, and I had not yet said a single word. I walked to the head of the table, pulled out Wade Kingsley's chair, sat down in it, and placed the forensic dossier on the polished mahogany with a sound that silenced every breath in the room. The leather briefcase Sterling carried clicked open behind me. Wade stood 3 feet away, his hands still frozen mid-gesture from the speech I had interrupted. And for the first time since I had known him, he had absolutely nothing to say. Sterling stepped forward and addressed the board with the measured legal cadence of a man who had rehearsed this moment for weeks. Members of the board, I am Sterling Prescott, fiduciary counsel to the Cornerstone Legacy Trust. Eugene Ashford holds 60% of Ashcombe Holdings through Sovereign Peak Capital, inherited from the estate of Howard Ashford. As majority shareholder, Mr. Ashford is exercising his right to assume the chairmanship effective immediately. Every appointment made by Wade Kingsley in the last 90 days is hereby nullified. The silence that followed was not the polite quiet of a boardroom processing information. It was the silence of a room understanding, all at once, that the ground beneath it had shifted. I opened the dossier. The pages turned with deliberate weight under my fingers. 15 offshore shell companies across 3 jurisdictions and 1 domestic Nevada entity, I said. Phantom invoices for consulting services that never existed. 1 internal audit manager, Clyde Farrell, 3rd row. 2nd seat, who was paid through that Nevada entity to redesign the company's audit protocols and make every stolen dollar invisible. I looked directly at Wade. He had just declared himself permanent executive director of a company he had been systematically draining, and he had done it in front of the man who owned 60% of it. I have the forensic trail, the banking records, and an audio recording of you, my wife, and my son raising champagne glasses and toasting to my death. Wade's jaw worked, but no sound came out. Then it did. This is, you cannot, the board voted on my appointment. You have no authority to. I have 60% authority. Wade. I closed the dossier. And I have this. I nodded once. The boardroom doors opened from both sides. 4 federal agents walked in with the unhurried precision of people who have executed this procedure many times. Wade saw the handcuffs before he saw the badges. The metal caught the overhead lights as the agent approached to brief. Clinical glint. And then the ratchet clicked around Wade's wrists at the head of the table he had claimed 4 minutes ago. The sound was small and mechanical and final. Wade said nothing. His mouth opened and closed twice. And then his chin dropped to his chest. and the most confident man I had ever known stood handcuffed in a boardroom that smelled of spilled champagne and cold sweat. Clyde Farrell stood up in the third row as if to leave. An agent placed a hand on his shoulder and pressed him back into his seat. His legal pad slid off the table and landed face down on the carpet. 11 years of suppressed audits, and his career ended with the sound of a notepad hitting floor. The champagne flute shattered on the hardwood, and my son fell into the nearest chair. Like a building collapsing floor by floor. The glass scattered across the wood in bright fragments, champagne pooling around his shoes. And Garrett Ashford, 42 years old, newly appointed vice president of a company that no longer recognized his title, pressed his fists against the mahogany table hard enough to make it vibrate, and began to sob. Every instinct I had ever carried as a father screamed at me to reach out. Every memory of holding that boy when he was small enough to sleep against my shoulder. Every school play, every birthday, every night I had checked his bedroom door. All of it surged against the wall I had built in that motel bathroom mirror. And then I heard it again, clear as the recording that had played it in room 12. His voice, casual and dismissive, explaining that my heart condition would solve the problem naturally, that my body would do what they did not have to, that nature would finish what they had started. "Dad," Garrett said, his voice cracked on the word. "Dad? Please, I did not know what I was doing. They told me it was restructuring." I did not understand what I was signing. "Dad, please, please do not do this." I looked at my son, 42 years old, tears streaming down the face I had cradled as an infant, his hands shaking the way mine had shaken in that motel room when I heard him laugh about my death. I turned away from Garrett and faced the board. The diamond necklace swung wildly against Lorraine's chest as she took the gallery stairs 2 at a time, the first graceless thing I had seen her do in 44 years of marriage. I turned away from Garrett's sobbing and faced her as she reached the boardroom floor, heels clattering against hardwood, mascara already streaking down both cheeks in dark lines that cut through the foundation she had applied that morning to celebrate Wade's coronation. "Eugene." She stopped 6 feet from me, breathing hard, her hands raised as if approaching something dangerous. "Eugene, please listen to me. Wade forced my hand. He told me you were hiding money, that the divorce was the only way to protect our family's future. I did not know about the shell companies. I did not know about the embezzlement. You have to believe me." Her voice cracked on the next word. "I am your wife." She said, "I am your wife," present tense, and the past tense she should have used hung in the air between us, like the ghost of a marriage she had murdered with secret toasts and forged signatures. The perfume she wore reached me before her words did. The same scent I had smelled through the cracked window of a rented sedan while she clinked glasses on Wade's balcony. The spilled champagne from Garrett's shattered flute still pooled on the hardwood behind her, and the open dossier on the table filled the room with the smell of leather and paper, and the end of everything. You were my wife, Lorraine. The divorce was finalized 30 days ago. You made certain of that. I kept my voice level. The board members sat motionless in their chairs, witnesses to a reckoning none of them had expected when they walked in this morning. And when you signed the decree claiming sole ownership of the house, you also claim sole liability for the mortgage attached to it. The mortgage your son forged using my digital signature. The mortgage that is now owned by the Cornerstone Legacy Trust. I paused long enough for the architecture to assemble itself in her mind. Which is to say, Lorraine. It is owned by me. The color drained from her face, the way it had drained from Wade's when I stepped into the doorway. But where Wade had gone rigid, Lorraine swayed a small, involuntary shift in her balance as if the floor had tilted beneath her. "That is not possible," she whispered. "The mortgage was in your name. The court transferred ownership and all encumbrances. The mortgage is an encumbrance. It follows the property, not the original borrower." I spoke with the mechanical precision of an engineer, reading specifications, because that is what this was. A structure I had designed, load-tested, and built to exact tolerances over 90 days. You fought for sole possession of that house, Lorraine. The court gave it to you, along with every dollar of debt attached to it, debt that you now owe to me personally. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. You have 24 hours to vacate before I begin foreclosure proceedings. I had carried that crumpled $20 bill in my jacket pocket for 30 days. Through the mirror transformation in the motel bathroom, through the 72-hour preparation sprint in the penthouse, through the suit fitting and the signature on the hostile takeover papers, I had known, from the moment it hit the wet concrete at my feet outside the courthouse, exactly when and where I would return it. I reached into my pocket. The bill was worn soft from a month of being carried against my chest. I smoothed it flat against the polished mahogany, pressing out the creases with my thumb. The same thumb that had hovered over the spacebar before playing the recording that ended my capacity for mercy and placed it on the table in front of her. "Here," I said, "for dinner tonight. Consider it a graduation gift." Lorraine stared at the $20 bill. She recognized it. I could see the recognition move across her face, like a shadow crossing a window. The same denomination, the same crumpled gesture, the same words her son had used while leaning out of a silver Porsche in the rain. I turned my back on the woman I had loved for 44 years and walked toward the boardroom doors without looking back. Behind me, the room held two sounds and nothing else. Lorraine's breathing, sharp and shallow as a cornered animal discovering that the cage she had built for someone else had locked around her instead. And somewhere to my left, Garrett's quiet sobbing, the only music the Ashford family would ever make together again. What does a man do with the hour after he has destroyed everyone he ever loved? I walked through the boardroom doors and left behind the sound of Garrett's sobbing and Lorraine's shallow breathing and the $20 bill smoothed flat on polished mahogany. And I climbed the stairs to the upper floor of Ashcombe Manufacturing and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows and watched my victory play out below like a scene from someone else's life. Federal transport vehicles idled in the plaza. Agents marched Wade Kingsley out first, hands cuffed behind his back. Suit jacket pulled tight across his shoulders. Chin raised in the defiance of a man who still believed he could negotiate his way out. Clyde Farrell came next, smaller than I remembered, his wire-rimmed glasses askew, walking with the dazed shuffle of someone who had not yet understood that his career had ended with the sound of a legal pad hitting carpet. Garrett came last, head bowed, wrists cuffed in front of him. He did not look up at the building as the agent guided him into the vehicle. His head disappeared into the back seat and the door closed, and I pressed my forehead against the cold window glass and waited to feel something. Triumph, relief, vindication, anything. I had spent 38 years inspecting structures after catastrophic failure, documenting what collapsed, cataloging what survived, assessing what could be salvaged. Now I stood at the window performing the same inspection on my own life. And the report was not encouraging. The structure had passed, the engineering was sound. Every load-bearing element had held. But the building was empty. Every room cleared, every hallway silent, every door opening onto nothing. I touched my breast pocket out of habit and felt Howard's pen still there. The only weight I still recognized. For 90 days, I had known exactly who I needed to be in every room I walked into. Broken man, forgiving father, patient creditor. Now, in an empty one, with no one left to perform for. I did not, on the sidewalk below. Lorraine stood alone in her cream dress, diamonds catching the July sun, clutching her handbag with both hands. The Porsche was gone impounded. I assumed, or simply abandoned by a driver who was now in federal custody. She watched her son's vehicle pull away and made no sound that I could hear from this height. She stood there for a long time. And then she turned and walked down the sidewalk, alone. And the diamonds at her throat were the most expensive things she would ever own. Sterling stood beside me at the window. He said the words I expected him to say. "You won, Eugene. Everything you set out to do, you accomplished it. Then why does it feel like I am standing in a building that just passed a structural inspection but has nothing inside it?" Sterling had no answer for that. Some questions are not meant for lawyers. The next morning I drove to Worthington. The neighborhood was quiet brick apartments with window boxes. A small park on the corner. The kind of street where people walked their dogs at 7 in the morning and waved to neighbors whose names they actually knew. I parked at the curb and climbed the stairs to the second floor and knocked. Celine opened the door with the baby on her hip. She was exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back, wearing a sweatshirt that had formula stains on the shoulder. The apartment behind her was small and clean, with baby toys scattered across a rug and laundry drying on a rack near the window. It smelled of coffee and baby powder, and the honest domestic normalcy that 90 days of war had made me forget existed. She had hidden the phone in the diaper bag, the one place Garrett would never search. And in that small act of defiance, buried inside the most ordinary object in a mother's life, was the only courage anyone in my bloodline had shown. "Your messages helped identify the fourth accomplice," I told her. "Sterling has ensured that your name appears nowhere in the federal case. You are protected." Celine, completely. She pressed her lips together and nodded. Her eyes were wet, but she did not cry. I set the trust documents on her kitchen table crisp. New pages that smelled of fresh ink. "This trust is for you and the baby, funded from my personal inheritance, separated entirely from the criminal proceedings. Garrett cannot touch it. The courts cannot seize it. It is yours, regardless of what happens next." "Why?" she asked. "Because you are the only person in this family who chose to do the right thing. And I will not let that cost you everything." Celine offered me coffee in a chipped mug. It was honest and simple, and the best thing I had tasted since this began. I sat at her kitchen table and held the mug with both hands, and the baby in her high chair reached out with one small fist and wrapped her fingers around my index finger. The grip was tight, instinctive, trusting in the way only someone who has never been betrayed can trust. I held my granddaughter's hand in a modest apartment in Worthington, and understood that this is not the boardroom, not the dossier, not the fortune was the only thing I had saved that was worth saving. 92 days earlier, a phone call from a woman I had never met was cut off mid-sentence. Now she stood in my office doorway. The same doorway Wade Kingsley had walked through 2 days ago, believing he owned the room behind it. And I owed her more than I could ever calculate. I had left Celine's apartment the morning before with my granddaughter's grip still warm on my finger, carrying the first fragile evidence that something in my bloodline had survived. Now it was time to rebuild what the conspiracy had nearly destroyed. The chairman's office smelled of fresh paint and new leather. Morning light fell across the restored desk. I rose and crossed the room to shake Nora Ballard's hand firmly. Brief, professional, exactly as it had been at Sterling's conference table weeks ago. 92 days ago, you called my office to warn me about a mortgage that should not have existed. I said, someone cut the line before you could finish. Your bank tried to bury your investigation. They reassigned you, restricted your access, and offered early retirement. You refused all of it, built the evidence on your own, and walked into Sterling's office with a box that changed everything. I gestured to the chair across the desk. I am offering you the position of Chief Compliance Officer at Ashcombe Manufacturing. Full independence, board-level authority, a direct reporting line to the chairman. Nora sat down with the same unhurried composure she had carried into every room I had ever seen her enter. How many whistleblowers had been silenced the same way? She almost was a supervisor walking in, a phone taken from a hand, an investigation buried under administrative reassignment. And how many of them had refused to stay silent? "I spent 31 years in banking compliance, Mr. Ashford," she said. "I have seen fraud buried and auditors bought. I took this evidence to your team because it was the right thing to do, not because I expected anything in return. But I will accept this position, because the system that failed here is the same system that fails everywhere, and I know how to fix it." The first thing Farrell did when Wade brought him in was rewrite the audit triggers to exclude offshore transactions below a certain threshold. "That is where this started. I want you to rebuild every protocol he destroyed, and build them so well that no one can ever do this again." She nodded once. The same single nod she had given when I told her in Sterling's office that her testimony would be the kill shot. Nora Ballard did not waste gestures any more than she wasted words. I poured coffee from a ceramic service on the credenza, not Motel Instant. Not Sterling's carafe, but my own. In my own office, for the first time. The cup was warm in my hands, and the building hummed beneath us with the sounds of a company returning to normal operations. Phones ringing, footsteps in hallways, the machinery of 400 jobs that had nearly been liquidated for the benefit of 3 men and the woman who had helped them, before Nora stood to leave. I asked the question that had lived in my chest for 92 days. "On day 0, you called and told me about the fraudulent mortgage. I asked whose computer authorized the transfer. You started to answer and the line went dead." I set my coffee down. "What were you going to say?" She had been 3 syllables away from saying my son's name on day 0. 3 syllables that would have changed everything and possibly destroyed the only chance I ever had to build the case that caught them all. "I was going to say your son's name," Nora said quietly. I had traced the authorization to Garrett Ashford's executive terminal that morning. The digital signature hash matched his credentials exactly. "I was about to tell you." And then my supervisor walked into my office, took the phone from my hand, and disconnected the call. I absorbed it the way I had learned to absorb everything in the last 92 days, silently, completely, with my hands flat on the desk and my breathing steady. If I had heard her say Garrett's name that morning, I would have confronted him within the hour. I would have demanded answers, made threats, shown every card in my hand before I knew I was holding any. The disconnected call that had haunted me since day 0 had not been a setback. It had been the accident that gave me time. Nora shook my hand and walked out as the new chief compliance officer. I sat alone at the desk and opened the top drawer. Inside, a single envelope waited, stamped, addressed in my own handwriting, and sealed. A letter to my son in federal detention. I had been writing it in my head for 92 days, and I had not yet decided whether to send it. I placed Howard Ashford's gold pen in the breast pocket of the charcoal suit, the same pen I had used to sign divorce papers on day 0, and the same pen I had used to sign the hostile takeover documents that ended the war. The letter to Garrett had sat in the desk drawer for 2 days. I had written 4 drafts before settling on the one that said, "The only thing that mattered. I did what I had to do. I am still your father. The rest is up to you." I placed it in the outgoing mail tray on my way through the lobby, and the smooth edge of the envelope slid from my fingers with a finality that felt like setting down a weight I had carried since the moment I heard my son laugh about my death. Some bridges you burn, some you leave standing. I was no longer certain which kind this was. I walked the corridors of Ashcombe Manufacturing for the last time, past the boardroom where Wade had crowned himself and I had dethroned him, past the service door I had stood behind in the dark, listening to a man erase my legacy in 4 sentences, past Nora Ballard's new office, where the light was already on and her banker's box sat unpacked on the desk, the same box she had carried into Sterling's conference room weeks ago, now relocated to the office of the man who had been paid to ensure it would never exist. I paused at her open door. She looked up, and I nodded once. She nodded back. That was enough. I had built this company for 38 years. I had saved it in 90 days. And now I was leaving it in better hands than mine, a restructured board, Sterling as fiduciary trustee, and a chief compliance officer who had refused to be silenced when every institution around her tried to shut her mouth. The Maybach idled at the curb. The driver held the door. I looked up at the building one more time. The building Howard had started with a single warehouse and a handshake. The building I had expanded beam by beam across 4 decades of early mornings and late nights, and I got in the car. The leather seat was cool against my back. The interior smelled of new leather and morning air drifting through a cracked window. I drank the last cup of coffee I would drink in Columbus, clean and strong and bittersweet. The taste of an ending that was also a beginning, and the Maybach pulled away from the curb and merged onto the interstate heading east. Columbus disappeared in the rearview mirror the same way my old life had disappeared slowly at first, then all at once. The skyline I had helped build, one structural beam at a time, shrank to a silhouette against the July sky, and then to nothing at all. What remained was a highway stretching forward into a future I had not yet learned how to occupy. My phone vibrated against my thigh. A notification from Cornerstone Legacy Trust. 12 words on the screen. Foreclosure complete, property vacated. Lorraine was gone. The house was empty. The home where I had carried my son through the front door as an infant, where I had celebrated 30 anniversaries, where I had believed for decades, longer than I should have, that loyalty was a foundation that could not crack. That house stood vacant now, and the man who built it was riding east in a car that cost more than his motel room had charged for the entire war. I was 70 years old. I had assets I had never asked for, a company I had saved from the people who tried to kill it, a granddaughter in Worthington, whose grip on my finger was the strongest thing I had felt in 90 days, and a letter traveling through the postal system toward a son who might never forgive me for becoming the man he forced me to become. The gold pen pressed against my chest through the suit fabric like a second heartbeat. Howard's pen. The pen that had signed everything, the divorce papers, the trust documents, the hostile takeover, the operational transfer. The pen that had started this story in a boardroom ambush and ended it in an outgoing mail tray. I closed my eyes and rested my head against the leather seat. The interstate hummed beneath the tires. Steady. The first peaceful sound I had heard in 90 days. Behind me, a city. Behind me, a family. Behind me. 40 years of loyalty repaid with forged signatures, stolen millions, champagne toasts to my death, and a crumpled $20 bill thrown at my feet in the rain. They taught me what silence looks like when your family decides you are worth more dead than alive. I taught them what it costs. And to you listening to my story, remember this: I spent 44 years believing that loyalty was enough. That if I showed up every day, gave everything I had to my family and my work, the people I loved would never turn against me. I was wrong. Not because loyalty is worthless, but because I gave it blindly, without ever asking whether it was being returned. Do not make my mistake. Do not wait until the people closest to you have already drawn the blueprint for your destruction before you open your eyes. This revenge story taught me something I wish I had learned decades earlier. Silence is not weakness, and patience is not surrender. When they stripped me of everything, I did not scream. I did not beg. I watched, I listened, and built. Every person who hears a revenge story like mine wants to know how the ending feels. I will tell you the truth. It feels hollow until you find the one thing worth saving. For me, it was a granddaughter's hand wrapped around my finger and the knowledge that I could still choose who to protect. I believe God put me through this fire not to destroy me, but to show me what truly mattered, and to burn away everything that did not. If this revenge story stayed with you, I would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment and tell me, what would you have done differently? Would you have sent that letter? Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your time means more to me than you know. Please remember that certain names, places, and details in this story have been changed or fictionalized for narrative purposes. The emotions and the lessons, those, are real.